Good morning, afternoon, or evening to today's webinar brought to you by the AIA Housing Knowledge Community Open Architecture Collaborative with technical support from EDI International. We're excited to bring you today's program of the Technology of Inclusive Design, hosted by the Enterprise Rose Fellowship, Architectural Rose Fellowship. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction, and then Christopher Scott will take the panel from there. We will have today, so Chris Scott is the director of the Enterprise Rose Fellowship. He's got a background in real estate, finance, renewable energy, nonprofit community development, a very diverse background which led him to the Architectural Rose Fellowship program. And he also has a BS in Systems Engineering from University of Virginia and a Master's in Urban Planning from Harvard. So today's presenters will be Chris, as well as 3 Architectural Rose Fellows currently at their stations, Nick Satterfield, Keziah Haviland Montgomery, and Alan Coe. Today we'll be learning about the different ways that data can be leveraged as an engagement tool to actually have a more informed dialogue with community members. We'll talk about different strategies for tailoring engagements for very specific cultural aspects of each community that can, and how technology can be both inclusive but also a little bit limiting. We'll talk about the structural and situational barriers keeping underrepresented and marginalized communities from being fully included in the process. And lastly, we'll talk about a few case studies to investigate some of the tactics of participation and more multi-tiered strategies for outreach and engagement, and especially the most important part of building relationships in this process. With that, I'll let Christopher take over the course description in a moment. Logistics, if you have questions, feel free to ask them throughout the presentation in the question box on your screen, on your toolbar. We will aggregate the questions towards the end of the panel discussion and then relay those back to the presenters. And anything that we don't get to, we can also put you in email contact at the end. So with that, basic copyright materials, please understand that you have to give written permission to the presenters before reusing this material. A compliance statement from the AIA. However, also do know that this is being recorded, and we will post it on the Open Architecture Collaborative YouTube channel for further view. And we will also have the presentation available afterwards. And with that, I will give it over to Christopher Scott. Thank you so much for joining us, Christopher.
Thank you, Garrett. Let me get in the full screen mode here. So again, thank you, Garrett, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to the webinar series we are calling the Technology of Inclusive Design. As Garrett mentioned, my name is Christopher Scott. I'm the Program Director for the Rose Architectural Fellowship. The fellowship is one of many design programs administered by Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national intermediary of community development. Since its inception in 2000, the Rose Architectural Fellowship has achieved impactful results by advancing community engagement, sustainability, and design excellence in the community development field. I am joined on this webinar by 3 current Rose Fellows, and I will introduce them shortly. But first, I want to set the table for the topic of this webinar. A helpful jumping off point to understanding the fellowship is through the track record of achievement that the program has had over time. Over the course of 17 years, the program has produced 69 fellows working across the country in urban, small town, and rural contexts. And through these experiences, the fellows have helped create over 11,000 units of housing, primarily serving low-income or otherwise vulnerable populations. A core aspect of the Rose Fellowship's Thesis of Change is that we believe that resident-centered design strategies are the key to enhancing the quality, design, and performance of the built environment for the benefit of primarily low-income individuals. The business model to achieve that outcome is to partner emerging architects with not-for-profit place-based organizations for a 3-year term with the aim of embedding design excellence in the community development field. We dub our fellows community-engaged designers because a central part of their role is integrating the insights of residents into the housing and open space interventions they propose. In this way, a critical input to their design process is researching the humans that will ultimately live in, work in, and play in the buildings they develop. So naturally, a participatory design process is a core of the way our fellows execute their work. The challenge then is how, through that participatory process, to effectively tap the wisdom that residents hold. Typically, we may have understood the community meeting format or grassroots door-to-door conversations as the effective foundations of participatory processes. More recently, in the age of crowdsourcing and social media, we've seen the emergence of technology and specifically data-driven approaches to facilitate community-engaged design. In many instances, the integration of technology in the community-engaged design process makes a ton of sense. Still, as our fellows will relay, there are some drawbacks to an over-reliance on technology. We are calling this webinar The Technology of Inclusive Design, and that title can connote a number of different perspectives. Figuratively speaking, when we use the term technology, we want to understand the actual effective strategies that lend themselves to authentic inclusive design. In some cases, the effective strategy isn't data-driven technology at all, but rather is achieved through the interpersonal dialogue with residents. But from a literal sense, if you accept that data-driven technologies are effective, then we want to explore what are the specific technological platforms that are most conducive to supporting participatory design. In all instances, we are going to draw on the insights of empirical outcomes from our work in the field. Now, the introduction of our panelists. In order to help unpack this discussion, again, I've invited 3 current Rose Fellows who are working in different geographies, in different demographic communities, and with different types of place-based organizations to share a bit about the participatory strategies they are trying out. The fellows are going to give a brief presentation introducing their background and their work and showing examples connecting their design outcomes to specific community engagement strategies. What we expect to uncover is how they leverage technology in that pursuit of design excellence. After the presentations, we will engage in a short, moderated Q&A, followed by opening the floor to questions from the audience. I'd like to remind you, as we are going through the presentations, if questions surface for you, please jot them down in the Q&A box so that we could queue them up for the end of the webinar. And if your question is directed to one of the fellows, please list that fellow's name in your question. With that, I'd like to pass it off to our first fellow, Alan Coe, who works in Poughkeepsie, New York. Take it away, Alan.
Thanks, Christopher. And I'm just going to ask you to advance the slides as I see necessary. As Christopher said, my name is Alan Coe, and I'm working in the Hudson Valley of New York State in a city called Poughkeepsie. And I'm working with 2 organizations through a partnership for this fellowship. One is called Hudson River Housing, and the other is Mass Design Group. I'm embedded in Hudson River Housing day to day. The organization started in the 1970s as a volunteer organization aimed at addressing homelessness. And today we offer a continuum of services to address the consequences of homelessness, which range from emergency overnight sheltering to the development of affordable rental and first-time home ownership opportunities. My work focuses on affordable housing development and community building and engagement. And in this capacity, I'm charged with ensuring that the 2 or 3 are in constant conversation with each other. Our goal is to build projects that not only provide quality housing, but are also responsive to greater needs and priorities of our community, such as accessible education, an economy, youth engagement, equitability, and so forth. Next slide, please. In Poughkeepsie, this means trying to build capacity in our residents, diversifying the economy by scaffolding small businesses and local assets, and not just creating opportunity, but making that opportunity accessible and welcoming for everybody. We see these actions of community building and development as strategies that can help us embed socioeconomic resilience into revitalization, thereby creating a more equitable future. Next slide. Today, Poughkeepsie is embarking on an ambitious plan for revitalization, and we're just going to stay on this slide for a while, with planning and building by private developers, nonprofits, city, county, and state governments who are all working towards one goal. Much of this planning relies on specific ideas of renewal, however, and attempts to mix that with big data from higher level sources such as census data, as well as some cursory engagement, which I'll explain more about later. There are a lot of top-down strategies, luxury and market rate apartments, a focus on existing commercial corridor and amenities for tourists, all relying on hopes for outside investment and trickle-down economies. But it's really difficult for me to watch because ultimately this strategy, regardless of what the merits here are, it exacerbates some of the structural challenges we face. Poughkeepsie has been contracting for decades. We're 90 miles outside of New York City, and as the global and national economy has changed, we have faced a lot of huge swings one way or the other. But the city is economically, physically, and socially distressed right now, and it is leaning on traditional top-down, sort of pseudo-data-driven strategies of revitalization. A lot of the discussion of equitability and inclusive revitalization, of course, has its roots in history. Poughkeepsie was subjected to codified racism and marginalization. Redlining of the city was a very specific and detrimental policy that wove the fabric of the city. And even when it was outlawed, neighborhoods were shaped and maintained based on bias towards or away from certain sectors of the city. And today, when revitalization focuses on specific areas to invest time and resources, for example, our waterfront on the Hudson River or the Central Business District, we're perpetuating these historic mistakes by neglecting other areas. Hudson River Housing does a lot of work with engagement and trying to draw out hidden qualitative data, then marry the two, essentially meeting the top-down strategies that the city proposes with our own ground-up efforts. Today, I want to talk about one specific example, the north side of the city. This is the historically African-American community of the city, and which was deemed a high-risk investment for banks in the 1930s and 40s. And after redlining was made unlawful, it was still zoned in such a way that it became a food desert, and it was eventually cut off from the commercial strip of the city by a state highway. So this is sort of the context we're working in. These neighborhoods continue to be underserviced and unmaintained, especially when comparing them to areas that the city is investing in. And importantly, it reinforces distrust in the community for initiatives that do seek to use community participations or grassroots input in pre-development and planning like our organization does. The slide that you see now is a typical city-run engagement session, and I always show it in contrast to what type of work that our organization does. The city relies quite a bit on higher level data. Again, that's census data, and also data that they gather themselves. Communication and outreach by email and online posting, research by groups based in the city. And the challenge that we find is that these top-down engagement strategies tend to draw a very certain slice of the city. This picture shows, again, that typical engagement session. Everyone here, I should say, I'm taking the picture, and everyone else here identifies as Caucasian and mostly middle class. Next slide, please. Even though the city as a whole is quite diverse. That's just some basic data. So as you see, the Caucasian population in our city is not even necessarily in a majority. The communities that aren't present during these types of conversations are mostly poor people of color who make up over 2/3 of our city. The poverty rate in Poughkeepsie is a little bit over 25%. And one of the next neighborhoods slated for major revitalization is one that is even more minority majority, the Middle Main neighborhood where Hudson River Housing does much of its work. It's nearly 75% people of color, and the area median income is about 60% of the city as a whole. This methodology that the city pursues therefore creates barriers, and often community engagement sessions end up reflecting, very specific ideals, very specific, I think, priorities. Next slide, please. Hudson River Housing, our strategies try to target those specific communities that have been underserved to try to uncover that qualitative information that tends to be unseen, and thinks of them as integral to the social fabric and the history of the city, creating resilient, positive change by diversifying the economic base. But for us to galvanize and activate this community, we have to overcome the hesitancy that's been created after years and years and decades of really top-down, quote-unquote, data-driven engagement that, again, only is open, whether perceived or really open, to a specific slice of the community. Next slide. We work through a multi-tiered strategy of engagement. Our hope is that we can stay ahead of displacement that will push these communities away even more and foster that cultural value that's deeply embedded but hidden. So we do start with data, right? Broad census data that the city starts with as well. But then we couple that with finer grained information that we collect through different means, such as a community impact survey, in which we're on the ground talking to people one-on-one for weeks at a time. We also have standard public forums, but we also do other creative street outreach methods to personally speak with those who wouldn't attend town halls because they might be intimidating. We develop and build resident leadership through our community leadership program and our youth employment programs that both target low-income communities and communities of color. And those last methods really help us build and reinforce bridges to these marginalized communities so that we can leverage them as we develop projects in the future, sort of creating leaders, tapping those leaders, and then listening to what they have to say as representatives of their community. Next slide. And a good example of putting these strategies into use is one of our latest projects. It's called the Poughkeepsie Underwear Factory, which was just opened in April. It's the adaptive reuse of a historic linens factory in the heart of the most distressed part of the city, bridging those north side neighborhoods that I spoke about and the commercial strip that is also blighted. It's become a flagship for our ambition to transform this neighborhood based on art and food expertise, and specifically that expertise as related to the communities that are embedded here. So rather than taking that top-down approach, sort of building up from the bottom and developing something that can serve those priorities and those needs. The building is a mixed-use building. 1/3 of it is commercial space, but we were very specific about programming it with social impact, community-oriented enterprises. Our commercial tenants thus include a local coffee roaster that employs formerly homeless through an apprenticeship program where they could learn basic job skills, a community kitchen that is available for business incubation, and arts and film-based nonprofits offering training to both children and adults at accessible rates. What we're trying to do here is to be intentional with our projects and intentional about our engagement to get us there, responsive to both the realities demonstrated by big data, but also the situational nuances that we understand through these engagement activities in hopes that these marginalized communities can once again surface and flourish in a way that a macro view can't necessarily accomplish on its own. And we really see this as the driver of what can be economic change and sustainable economic revitalization across the city in a way that also addresses those top-down concerns. And for us as a developer, it's really about informing how we can further invest in the neighborhoods we serve while helping us repair that damage, that hesitancy, that history that's been present for nearly 100 years. The years of codified and reinforced neglect that has created the situation that we're in. And we want to do it through an experience that demonstrates that we are listening to priorities of the community. We're constantly learning a lot through this process. Hudson River Housing, at its core, is really a housing organization. But we're trying to use this engagement and community building and fold those aspects into other data resources, into that technology, as ways to create more opportunity and better outcomes for our clients and our city. That's a basic summary of my work here, and I look forward to fielding the questions at the end of the call.
Thank you, Alan. We're going to jump ahead to Keziah now, halfway across the country. Take it
Okay,
over,
thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Keziah, and I've worked in creative placemaking and architecture for several years now, both in Austin, Texas, and currently I'm at Thunder Valley CDC. So Thunder Valley is located in southwest South Dakota at the center of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is home to the Oglala Lakota Nation, or I guess it's better known to most Americans as the Sioux. The reservation covers upward of 2 million acres, 34 of which belong to the Thunder Valley Regenerative Community. Thunder Valley CDC sees this place as an opportunity to reclaim their identity as Oglala Lakota people, to strengthen their local economy, and to create safe, high-quality housing and community space that is unique to their culture. For the past few centuries, Native people have struggled to survive a lifestyle that was prescribed to them by Western culture. The people at Thunder Valley CDC are working to dismantle these lifestyles and to create their own future, a future that is rooted in who they are as Oglala Lakota people. The problems faced by this community are as large as the social injustices that created them. Oglala Lakota County consistently ranks among the top of the nation for all of the statistics that you don't want your community associated with. So next slide. Thunder Valley CDC chooses not to focus on these statistics, but to use them as an indicator that their approach to community development cannot focus solely on housing, but must be a holistic effort to revive economy, spiritual practice, culture, health, sovereignty, and quality of life. So after, I guess it was about 3 years of community engagement, Thunder Valley CDC used local feedback to create their 7 focus areas: food sovereignty, home ownership, social enterprise, workforce development, Lakota language, youth leadership, and community development, which is the area that I'm working in. Next slide. So the regenerative community development will create the most visible change, but without these other program areas, its chance of being successful would really diminish. So we're not just building houses for people here, but we're building people for the houses. In the next 10 to 15 years, we hope to complete this culturally unique net zero community development and expand all of our program areas to grow into this space. So next slide. Community engagement is critical to the success of Thunder Valley CDC's mission. For lasting positive change to occur, the ideas that spur this change must come from the local community. The reservation is constantly bombarded with ideas from outsiders who just know how to fix things here. And often these ideas don't really pan out. Understandably, given historic context, ideas from outsiders are not often well received. Thunder Valley CDC is really depending on its neighbors and the reservation at large to participate in a process that will guide us in our decision making. So next slide. My example of this is going to be the architecture itself. One of our questions was, what is modern Lakota architecture? So how do you go from a teepee circle or a tioshpae to a modern home without losing a sense of what it means to be Lakota? The Lakota went from a really light, portable architecture that was meant for nomadic tribes to government-issued housing. So no modern Lakota architecture was really developed. So our architects have really depended on Thunder Valley CDC to work with the community to get feedback and really specific descriptors of what should be included and how the site should work. So for example, the homes themselves are arranged in the form of a tioshpae, with a common space at the center. And this mimics the old ways of setting up their communities. You can see that in that little diagram to the right there. All of the homes have their main entrance facing east to meet the sun, and they all include cedar wood by the entries. This wood marks passage for Lakota people. Next slide. Our community worked with the architects and our artist advisory committee on the community building, which is pictured down in the bottom right of this slide. The community building was initially rejected as the first iteration of it was non-representative of their culture. The community then worked together to kind of deconstruct their traditional forms, such as the teepee or the sweat lodge or the powwow ground, and then fed the architects information such as, all of these have stone rings at the bottom. They all have east entryways. They're super tectonic, exposing exactly how their structure works. It's really vital that there's a connection with the sky. So what came back after the architects received and processed all of this information was the bottom right image. So you can kind of see that through this quick diagram, see that progression. And we showed this to the community at the next meeting, and everybody was just overjoyed. They really respected the architects for doing such a good job, and people were saying things like, this building really feels like us. So I am not Lakota. I am a community outsider here, and I have had to really completely reevaluate my approach as to how to engage the community here. I'm not ashamed to say that I also came here with ideas, like most people, but I was very quickly humbled by Thunder Valley CDC's approach and ability. I learned to sit back and become a better listener, to hand facilitation over to community members, constantly check myself and my intentions, to use methods that keep me from being at the center of any meeting. And I've worked with a team to come up with creative ways to engage a community of 35,000 people that's spread out over 2 million acres. So we're still at the beginning of our 10 to 15 year process here. We intend this process to be organic and to change as new generations become involved. The adaptability of approach is an effort to match the wants and needs of future users. So there's still a lot of information to uncover out there, and we're really open to the ways of doing it. And we expect that whatever we're doing right now probably won't be the way we have to do things in 10 years. So that's all.
Great, thank you, Keziah. So we've been in New York, we've been in South Dakota, and I'd love to go to the deep south. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing well. Christopher, can you hear me?
Yeah, let's go to New Orleans.
Okay.
Take it away.
All right, I'm going to be pretty brief and give everyone a high-level overview of my work in New Orleans, and then also some of the things that I was doing prior to joining the fellowship, because I just started in January. And so in an effort to get through this quickly and get to the questions, because I think that's really going to be where the richest part of the dialogue is going to happen. And so, as Christopher said, I am the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellow in New Orleans with the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority here in New Orleans. And so we like to call ourselves NORA. And so if you go to the next slide. NORA has actually been around for quite a while. They were established in 1968 as a community improvement agency founded by the Louisiana legislature. But I think what NORA is most known for now is our work after Hurricane Katrina. Following the storm, NORA was charged with the disposition of nearly 5,000 properties that were acquired through the state by the former Road Home program. NORA's strategy to dispose of these 5,000 properties is essentially threefold. The diagram here you can see there are three programs that we implemented following Katrina to dispose of these properties. The first is the Lot Next Door program. The second is affordable housing development, and the third is auction, which we like to just call that market rate housing. So the Lot Next Door program essentially provides first right of refusal to anyone that owns a property to the left or to the right of a NORA-owned lot. And we sell this property to the adjacent homeowner with a subsidy, the sales price being 10% of the appraised value. So that's sort of the first opportunity for us to dispose of these properties to help rebuild some of these neighborhoods. The second and third, we try to dispose of these properties equally. If we have a specific lot that has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of inquiries on, then we will put it up for auction. And like any other auction, the highest bid is awarded the property. The third is affordable housing development. And at NORA, we believe that giving people affordable housing opportunities all over the city, regardless of neighborhood, is crucial to the success of New Orleans. And so what we do is we provide a subsidy in the form of the land that NORA owns to affordable housing developers to provide home ownership opportunities for low to moderate income families. So if you go to the next slide. In addition to housing development, NORA has two other programs, one being our commercial revitalization work, and that's broken out into two separate programs, one being a commercial gap financing program. And so essentially what that is NORA will provide a small piece of financing to help make a development financially viable option. And so say a developer has 90% of the money they need, they just need that last 10%, NORA can provide the gap financing to get them to where they need to be. The second program is our Facade Renew program. And this is really, I think, more in line with what we're going to be talking about today. This is really driven by small business owners, community members. And so NORA has targeted a series of historical commercial corridors throughout the city. Our first round of Facade Renew programming is just wrapping up, and we're about to take on a second round of applicants. But this program is in the form of a reimbursable grant to restore and rehab historic structures on significant commercial corridors throughout the city. The photograph you see there is the Aritha Castle Haley Boulevard, and that was historically an African American and Jewish part of the city where there were, at one time, it was a very vibrant neighborhood. Our office is actually located on the corridor, and you can see there's some new street improvements with the neutral ground, as we like to call it, with some new trees and some new paving with bike lanes, as well as the facades on both sides of the street. NORA provided funding for the majority of the restoration work. The third program or series of programs that we have is through land stewardship, and there are multiple sort of sub-programs under this, but it's basically broken out into properties that NORA owns and maintains, and properties that NORA can either lease or sell to homeowners around the city. And so the land stewardship program really focuses on green infrastructure. We've implemented a series of pilot rain gardens throughout the city to help deal with stormwater and reduce flooding in the streets. But we've also provided opportunities for community gardens, urban agriculture, and just general kind of landscape beautification of people's properties. Go to the next slide. So prior to coming on at NORA, I worked in a pretty traditional architectural setting. I worked for Luckett & Farley Architects in Louisville, Kentucky. I was given the opportunity to both do a pretty good amount of design and construction administration work, but I also was really given the opportunity to drive a lot of ground level grassroots community development projects. So the bottom two images that you see, those are two projects that we did. One was on the bottom left was a conceptual effort for a technology center in eastern Kentucky. The bottom right is under construction right now. It's an orthopedic center in central Kentucky. But what I'd like to focus on is the top two bands of projects. And I think what they do is they really show the breadth of the work that we're doing. So this is 4 different neighborhoods these projects have taken place in. The top left was the Sobro neighborhood. You see kind of Sobro scattered throughout in the images. This was a neighborhood that our office was located in. It didn't really have an identity. It had some history, but really it was sort of known for being kind of had a lack of vibrancy and a lack of really any sort of cultural significance to Louisville. And so we were really tasked with sort of really diving deep and discovering what that identity is and what it could be. The top right is a project that we partnered with Youth Build Louisville and another architecture firm in Louisville, Studio Kramer Architects. And this is in a Smoketown neighborhood, and Youth Build really acted as the anchor institution. And Smoketown itself has a really rich cultural history, and so our job was not to sort of create that or discover that. It was to sort of work with the neighborhood that already knew who they were, and to give them the opportunities to enhance their street life and their opportunides. The sort of middle tier on the left, I Love My Neighborhood. This was a really interesting project that we did where we had a neighborhood group that came to us that really wanted to turn an old church into a community center. But they really had no funding, they had no organization, they really had no evidence that the community would support it other than the few people that were in this group. And so our task was really to help them understand and organize and get the community buy-in and get the effort supported to make sure that what we were doing was actually going to be something that the community wanted, needed, and would benefit from. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Christopher.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so we're going to open it up to a moderated Q&A here in a second. I just want to remind folks on the line again to jot your questions down in the chat box, and Garrett will assemble them. And after we do a short moderated Q&A, we'll open it up to your questions. So to the fellows, thank you for those presentations. They're great. We talked about at the beginning of this call that we view you as community engaged designers, right? And so we know that in this space of community development, developing consensus and coming to a common understanding of community needs can sometimes be challenging and even contentious. I could think of a number of tools that can help navigate processes and decision making, like opportunity mapping, storytelling, or data derived both within and from outside the community. What kinds of facilitation tools have you seen be most effective in achieving those consensus objectives? Let's start with Alan in New York.
Thanks, Christopher. That's a great question. And, I've been thinking about it since you actually pitched it. And I don't know if I could answer it in a way that presents you with a specific tool, right? I think about engagement and the idea of coming to consensus more as a almost frame of mind and a series of actions. Like for us, the scale of what we're doing and the scale of our community allows us the time and flexibility to just be really iterative about how we're working. There's a lot of on-the-ground conversations, and our results from like what we hear on the ground versus what we hear from higher level data informs our next steps. We're always sort of trying to figure out that question, how we can get consensus, and whether that means talking to community leaders who aren't necessarily elected officials and somehow reconciling that with data that we have through our street outreach. It really just means sort of, I guess, hypothesizing and theorizing what might work and what might answer the right priorities, and then bringing it back, right? And just being willing and patient, but also forward-thinking enough to sort of present what you think, be willing to be wrong, and be willing to change what that hypothesis is.
Kazaya, what are you seeing in South Dakota?
Yeah, I agree with Alan. I don't think that there is any kind of one tool that can be developed because community engagement is so unique to the situation it's being used for. I think there's three things that I can think of that we do with this community that generally work. The first is that it's really important that the style and facilitation of the meetings match the community's way of doing things. So for example, at all of our community meetings here, the more formal ones, we'll allow 30 minutes to an hour of social greeting time. And there's always food, a meal. There's always a prayer. Everyone always smudges off before we start the meeting itself. So we really tailor the meetings to mimic the social and spiritual get-togethers of this community to make the place that they're comfortable and set a positive tone for the meeting from the start. The second thing is that the people here really have a story to tell and a lot of great ideas to bring to life. So it's incredibly important to prove that we are listening to everyone. So people really want their voices to be heard, and sometimes they'll end up yelling over one another if they have to in order to do it. So it might not be as much about their contention with one another, but with not knowing whether or not you're really hearing them. So the way that we combat this is that we hold multiple engagement sessions with lots of different groups of people and throughout the design process. So we'll make sure that the priorities that are expressed by the community in previous meetings are shown either in paper or model form in the next one to really prove that we've listened and incorporated their ideas. We work really hard to manage expectations for this by explaining, exactly how we're using the information and that not everything that everyone suggests is going to make it into the design. Trying to keep things transparent and to also build trust. Also, there's multiple ways of listening, which brings me to my last little point. So third, instead of a single facilitator asking for questions from an audience at large, we provide activities for small groups that are seated at round tables. I don't think this is a new technique or anything, but we found that we get a lot more out of engagement when people are talking freely to their neighbors and to their friends and having a good time. Also, instead of trying to solve a singular issue by having some large determining vote on the spot, we emphasize that we want all ideas. So if you disagree on something, that's actually great. Please write both thoughts down. Please express both thoughts. That no one person has the right answer, but that everybody involved counts.
Thanks, Keziah. Nick, I kind of want to ask you a nuanced version of this question. You're our one fellow working in a public agency, and so I think you have a really interesting perspective. And thinking about your work within a bureaucracy and at a grassroots level, it has some interesting challenges and opportunities. In your grassroots role, you're engaging with residents, and with your public agency role, it's important to make those resident conversations really translate into meaningful action with external decision makers in government. So this is one area where we hear technology platforms and standardization can play a role. But they can also be reductive in some ways and may fail to capture the key pieces of the story. What are the approaches to solving these problems that you've encountered in NORA and New Orleans, and what have you found to be effective?
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I really like this question for a couple of reasons, but most importantly, I think it really highlights a major factor in determining the success of a project. Data is really helpful when testing and validating process and intervention. We have a lot of tools at NORA and with the City of New Orleans that we're using to do that, but data is very limited, and it's only useful when you know what questions to ask and you're informed enough to see what the data is telling us. Recently, I attended a panel discussion in New Orleans, and one of the panelists, Brian Lee of Colocate Design, responded to a similar question, and what I understood his response to mean was this. He said, it's important to differentiate engagement from organizing. Engagement, as it is often practiced, is just a form of data collection. How many people want to see X or Y? What are the top 5 assets of your community? What are the top 5 needs? Would you like to see more of or less of this? Organizing, on the other hand, starts first by building from a foundation of trust and developing relationships. From there, your purpose is to provide the community opportunities to make decisions and shape the things that impact their environment. This is important because the actual thing that's being developed isn't always as important and vital to the success of a project as the process we've taken along the way. Strong communities are built through strong relationships, trust, and mutual respect. Architecture plays a role in shaping these factors, and our job as designers is to facilitate a process that brings people together and equips them with the tools and resources to shape their community. And when I say that, when I talk about the tools and the resources that we're leveraging to shape our community, I have a couple of specific examples. And so everybody sort of outside of New Orleans understands the kind of risks that we face as a city with regards to flooding. But I think there's a misunderstanding about what that risk actually is. Most people think about the flooding of Katrina, the failure of the levee walls, as being our primary risk. But actually our primary risk as a city is from normal torrential rain that we get in the summer. It's not about storm surge, it's about rain that falls on our ground that we have to physically pump out. New Orleans as a city is below sea level, so every drop of rain that falls in the city has to be pumped out. And so one of the things we have to do is communicate that risk to our community. We've developed a series of tools, and we've partnered with for-profit and nonprofit organizations to really communicate people's risk. But what we also need to do is provide them with the tools and the resources necessary to do something about it. right? So one of the things that we're implementing, and we just piloted it last week with one of our community partners, we call it the Adaptation support tool. So what this is it's a proprietary software that we developed that can model rainwater and runoff. And we can take it to a community and say, okay, this is all of the things that we are doing in the public right-of-way with regards to green infrastructure. What does that impact for you? How does that storage capacity relate to an improvement in your life? Okay, we know that. Now, how can you, as a private citizen, enhance that? So what would happen if I put 2 rain barrels on my property? What would happen if I turned my driveway from concrete to crushed stone? What would happen if I put a bioswale along my property or created a detention basin in the backyard? And what we're doing is we're communicating risk, but we're also providing people options and opportunities to take a position and to control what that looks like in their neighborhood.
Great, thank you, Nick. I want to head back to New York. Alan, I was struck by your presentation. You shared that one slide of a pluralistic demographic makeup of Poughkeepsie's population, and it strikes me that in such a diverse community, data collection and analysis may be a little bit of a more nuanced exercise. In times when you need to sort of reconcile the empirical information that you're uncovering in your engagement with the more hard quantitative data that you get through the more mainstream data collection sources, how do you marry those 2 data sets to move projects forward, especially when those data sets are conflicting? And as a follow-on to that question, are there specific examples of how that dynamic plays out in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, my first reaction is just, it's a question that we're trying to solve right now, you know, and I'm a little bit inspired by what Nick had to say and sort of the differences between engaging and organizing, because I think looking at our work, you know, the work of us as a CDC as a nonprofit, and the work of what the city is doing, and looking at the engagement of what they're, or the engagement parts of what they're doing, the engagement parts of what we're doing, it's a really striking thing, right? It is a very nuanced environment to try to get sort of that fine-grained data and try to figure out really when you say marry the 2, it really becomes about convincing those top-level thinkers, those top-down thinkers, that the data that you're presenting is as valuable as the data that they're relying on, right? So we look at that census data, let's say, and, you know, I admit, like, we use it when it's useful to us, but we also use it as a framework to view sort of data that sometimes is conflicting. And I think what I'm realizing on the ground is that it's not just about understanding that data, that qualitative data that you're getting, but understanding how to frame it back in the conversation in terms of values, which could be, or how you value that data, or how you can get those top down thinkers to value that data as much as they value the data that they're relying on. The example that I'm thinking of specifically when I'm asked for one is this rezoning project that Poughkeepsie is undergoing. You know, the city is undertaking a rezone of our downtown commercial area, which is predominantly, as I explained in my presentation, a community of poor people of color. And, you know, that picture that I showed was one of their engagement sessions for the downtown rezoning. And you have these conversations with the consultants, and you have conversations with the city about ways you can mitigate force, like what you see could be displacement, right? And you show them the data, or we try to show them the data of the people that are there and show them the data of what they're projecting, and you try to explain the value of keeping the people who are there, right? Or you try to explain the value economically, you know, socially, in terms of capital, what you can do. And again, it's just conversation after conversation, trying to be optimistic that that you can embed sort of that approach, or you can embed that data, those stories that you're hearing into the city officials who are working on it. Again, ultimately, I'm relying on the fact that we are a small community and we do have leverage with our partners in the city who are very cooperative and collaborative. So you hope that in some ways you can be tactical and strategic, and you can prove that value. And when you do actually come to doing your own projects, you demonstrate through design how you can use both. I think both of those tactics are the ways that we're trying to address this question.
Great, thank you for that view, Alan. Keziah, I'm just sort of reflecting on your career path and how varied and diversified it's been. I mean, you've worked in a number of different settings in your career, from rural to urban, and now currently you're working in an indigenous community. So I'm curious to get your perspective on how do you make community engagement culturally appropriate for those different settings? And have you found that you've had to tailor engagement strategies and approaches to fit a particular community's way of thinking?
Hi, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I believe it's really important that the community engagement be tailored to the culture of the community it's serving. You know, if you create an environment that people are comfortable operating in, they're going to be more forthcoming and more honest. And as a designer, you're going to get a whole lot more out of that conversation. Technology may or may not be a part of that process. You know, here I was really lucky because all of my coworkers are also community members. So I was able to say, what is the appropriate way to set this up? How do we do things? And really just receive advice from them. Other places, just finding trusted members of the community that can sort of be your partners and help guide you in terms of interactions, you know, what is good, what doesn't work, to kind of foster, create that comfortable environment. So at Thunder Valley, we found that technology can be used to foster inclusion, but it can also be kind of exclusive. So our use of technology has generally been limited to collecting larger picture data. As you know, meaningful personal interaction is still a really important part of the culture here. So for us, a new phone app or an online survey or some sort of call-in campaign wouldn't really be all that helpful, because at its base, it assumes that most people have cell phones, or for that matter, just phones. So doing something like that would get us a really specific set of participants, which is mostly the young sort of teenage generation, which wouldn't really be the whole picture. So there are places where technology has been really helpful for us. An example of that is, at this point, accessing accurate data about the population on Pine Ridge is pretty much near impossible. The documented population ranges from 13,000 to 40,000. Unemployment ranges from 60% to 85%. And this all really just depends on the source. So to help us better understand the community, we've created a GIS map of lived-in homes, noted the condition of those homes, the demographics on the homeowners and the renters, because when the census comes around, or when other groups who are outside of this community come around, people don't necessarily trust them and won't give them all the information. Or, you know, it's a huge place and there's a lot of small backcountry roads, so it's just hard to really reach everybody unless you know where everybody is, and you can only really do that if you come from here. So it's been super helpful for us kind of understanding the population that we're working with, and creating that map and being able to draw from that map, and also going to those homes and talking to the residents and having them take a survey, or telling them about what we're doing at Thunder Valley and offering up opportunities that might be fitting for them. So we definitely use technology, but it's more for our personal edification and not our engagement. You know, our engagement, as I said, still really has to happen face-to-face with the community, because that's just how people operate here. So.
Great, thanks for that perspective, Keziah. I want to leave a couple of minutes for open floor questions here. And Garrett, I can't actually see the questions, so do you want to dictate a couple if they've come through, and we'll wind up at that point?
Yeah, Christopher, there are a bunch of questions coming in, and I think it speaks to the richness of the work people are doing and the desire for more real tools for this type of engagement, and one that's more informed by empirical data. But one of the questions that I think is pretty powerful that's coming through is how do you take the data and the analysis kind of to that next level of design, and at what point is kind of the architectural skills and technology that they use kind of brought into the process of design, specifically using the data that is collected or is decided to use. Like how do you kind of marry the two after you've done the engagement and need to provide that technical expertise?
So is this?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Alan. I wasn't sure like how we were going to do this, but what your question immediately made me think about is in my work with MASS. Again, I'm with both of these organizations. What we like to do is really use data to, in terms of design, to think about sort of what we're solving for. Right? It's really easy, I think, as architectural designers to be given a set program and to, like, let's say housing, and design housing that works. But if we don't understand how we're defining success, we won't necessarily know if our building is successful. What we try to do at MASS is sort of identify what we want our buildings to accomplish, right? Whether that is health related or whether that is employment related. And we try to look at how we can use that data through both direct and indirect impact to solve for those questions. I remember an example that I guess one of my mentors gave me was that he was looking specifically at, I think, health outcomes. And he was just looking at empirical data for a housing project that he worked on with a very specific community of over 50 female residents who were formerly homeless. And he worked the project to design it in a way that could integrate regular visits, like easily accessible regular visits from a medical intern, again, just as an example. And because of the way he designed it, he was able to take the data and decrease the number of visits to the hospital that these residents ended up having to go to. So that's sort of the first example that I think of.
Hey, this is Nick. I wanted to interject as well. With regards to the question, I think it's interesting, we're trying to understand how to translate all of this information into built form, and I'm pretty sure that that is the sort of primary task of an architect, whether it's community engagement data, whether it's a specific program that an owner gives you. That's kind of the secret sauce of architecture. We understand process, and we understand how to translate that process into a product. And to Alan's point, I think what this robust community engagement, data, information, experience tells us is what the problem is that we're trying to solve for. And I think where data can really come in and be very beneficial is actually measuring and monitoring whether the intervention that we've selected is actually accomplishing those goals. And so, a very simple, easy solution that we're working with here in New Orleans is with green infrastructure. We have all these projections that this preliminary data has told us about how much we will reduce runoff, what our storage capacity is, all of these things. But we also need to validate that. And I think the validation of that data and communicating that to the community and to the neighbors is extremely important, because if we say something is going to filter rainwater, it's going to make everything great, you're not going to flood on your property anymore, and they're still dealing with flooding, then that's a credibility issue for us. And so we need to make sure that we're doing enough engagement on the front end to communicate what we're doing, understand if there are some things that we don't necessarily know, the nuances of a neighborhood, the nuances of a specific site, specific demographic, but then we also need to follow up with that and make sure that whatever the problem is that we identified in this exercise is actually being addressed and it's actually successful. So I think data comes in on the front end and on the back end as well.
Thank you for sharing, Nick. Before we wrap up, I just want to say that you'll get an email in about an hour with some survey questions. Please do fill that out to get your continuing education credits. But with that, also, Christopher, if you could wrap us up with a little bit more data on the Rose Fellowship. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call, and thank you to our fellows for presenting. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the fellowship applications are currently open. So for anyone on the call that wants to join the fellowship, the deadline is July 9th, and we have fellowships open in Los Angeles, Atlanta, Utah, Minneapolis, and Philadelphia. So thanks again. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions, and enjoy your day.